Father, thanks for being here.
So great to be here.
Can we have the Our Lady of Victory feast day coming up and Our Lady of the Rosary coming up? And there's a real historical story behind this one. And I would love for you to share the story.
Okay.
Can we start there?
Start with the story and start with the observation that we are a community that has its bones in history. I used to teach at university, and one of the things I always instructed my students in is that you have to know history, no matter what discipline. If you don't have history and a knowledge of history, it's like having a body without bones. It just sort of becomes a blob. And especially for us who are Christians, God entered into history. God became flesh in history. And that history has been transformed into a new meaning, salvation history. It's different than the other religion that's going to be part of the story that we're of the Our Lady of Victory, namely the religion of Islam, which is an ahistorical religion. What do I mean by that? The understanding is that when God revealed himself for the Muslim, the revelation of God is in a book. People often think that the Quran is the parallel of the Bible. It's not. For the Muslim, the Quran is what Jesus is for the Christian. It's the, if you will, in liberation, God becoming word in a book that stands outside of time. So whenever we engage in this conversation between Christianity and Islam, which will be the foundation of this story, we have to remember that kind of fundamental difference in who the Prophet Muhammad is and what the Christian faith is. And it gets very serious because, and I think we have to notice this is not a story just in the past, but it is a continuation of a story in the past. Someone pointed out that there are 2 billion Christians and there are 1.5 billion Muslims. There will be no peace in the world if there's not peace between Christians and Muslims. Yet at the very same time, the struggle that manifests itself in violence and war continues in our times. And we'll come to that a bit later. But that's the sad story of the relationship between Islam and Christianity in the main. So, the story of Our Lady of Victory. Well, first of all, it's an older celebration. It started in the 13th century.
Oh.
Because there was a heresy in southern France. They were called the Cathars, which means the pure ones, or Albigensians. Theirs was a typical kind of, if you will, heresy in Christianity, where some people think they are the supreme elect and that they have the pure understanding of what is truth. And they rejected a lot of the church's teaching, even to the point of believing that there were two gods. There was a good God and a bad God. Manichaeism, we used to call that. And they would fight each other. In any case, this spread like wildfire in the southern part of France, in Languedoc. And it became a political and a religious conflict that resulted in something that it's a whole other story called the Albigensian Crusade, in which the Pope asked the French king to confront this development. And it was a bloody confrontation. Now, out of that struggle, we meet St. Dominic, because St. Dominic was sent to preach against the Albigensians, but he was deeply unsuccessful. Okay? He had an insight. The Albigensians kind of lived a very, if you will, strict ascetic life, whereas those who went to preach against them came from a church that was pretty wealthy and perhaps did not, if we will, walk the talk. So Dominic had this insight: if we're going to preach the truth of Jesus, we had better look like the truth. And so that was the foundation of that community of preachers, the order of preachers, the Dominicans. And in that, as tradition tells us, Our Lady gave him the gift of the Rosary as if you will, a foundation of this preaching, a practical way to support not only himself, but those who he was preaching to. And the preaching became very successful. The wars, however, continued in bloody butchery. And there was a battle, Busha, that happened in the year 1317, and 1217. And it was a rather miraculous battle in that the forces of the French king, vastly outnumbered, defeated the Albigensian forces. And it was then that the feast of Our Lady of Victories began, a celebration of Mary's intercession, as it was understood, in this victory against all odds of the Christian Catholic forces against this heretical forces. Already we see what in modern ears would be a great complication about all of this: battle and war and religion.
Yes.
And feeding into the narrative, all wars were caused by religion. Well, even in the Cathar Wars, a lot of it was political, because the French forces that came to fight in the south, they were there because if they could kill off the Cathar nobility in the south, they would get all the land. Nonetheless, out of all of this misery, something of freedom happened. I mean, this is also the time of, I don't know if you know St. Peter Damian, Peter the Martyr. He was killed by Cathars. And as he was traveling around, he was a Dominican priest preaching in this time, and they attacked him, and he was the one who, they split his head with an axe, and he wrote with his own blood on the ground, "Credo," I believe.
Wow.
And that was the essential kind of struggle. When religion was at the center of people's being, it is of ultimate things. And the persecution and suffering that is visited upon people of faith is a chance in which they are tested in their faith. And who is the one who supports that test, as she does today? Our Lady. Okay. This is becoming a bit, there's the roots of it.
There's the roots.
Now, by the 16th century, the 1500s, the history was a really difficult one in Europe. Reformation had happened.
Right.
Counter-Reformation had happened. There were great struggles, particularly between the rising family called the Habsburgs, who were the Holy Roman Emperors and devoutly Catholic, and the Catholic King of France. But the French have always been rather, how do I put this, utilitarian in their Catholicism. They were quite willing to set it aside, as Cardinal Richelieu would do, if it was for the benefit of their own financial and territorial gains. For us, Jesus just told us, hey, you can't serve God and mammon. You're going to serve one or the other. And that's been a constant struggle. God is fine unless there are issues of mammon. Then you look to where your best chance is, right? And so the French looked to a kind of an alliance with the greatest power in the Mediterranean at the time, which was the Ottoman Empire. Now, in 1453, the Ottomans had finally taken Constantinople. It is now Istanbul, which is a Turkish version of Constantinople. And that was the end of the Roman Empire. That was the end of the Christian control of that part of the world. You know, the Ottoman Empire for 600 years was the largest empire on earth. It only ended in 1922 after their defeat in the First World War. And this empire was extremely aggressive. The Turkic peoples were very strong and aggressive, and Islam has always been a religion of the sword, of jihad. Yes, people talk about the spiritual jihad. That's a nice way of wishful thinking. The reality in the past was jihad was done with the sword. You spread the faith with the sword. And they were extremely powerful. And one of the things that they had was one of the most advanced militaries in the world. This is in the 1500s now. And the core of their army was a group called the Janissaries. And Janissaries were great warriors, but they were all Christian boys who had been taken from their families, Christians living in the Islamic Ottoman Empire, and forcibly converted into Islam and just become absolute fierce and focused warriors.
So they're taken as children.
That was
And
just
it's-
as children.
and
They would go
so
in.
they don't know the difference.
They have no idea, so they would go in. The Ottoman forces would come into a Christian village and say, "Okay, bring out your kids." All those boys are going.
Wow.
Just take them away from their families. That was it. And so they were quite fanatic and disciplined. Okay? So with those forces and with their technology, especially with guns and cannons, the Ottomans expanded. In the early part of the 1500s, they defeated their longtime foes, the Hungarians. There was constant battle between the Ottoman forces, the Turkish forces, the Islamic forces, and the Christian Hungarian forces in the east. And so they'd come all the way up there such that in 1529, this is just a few years after the start of the Reformation, Vienna, which was the key to all of Europe, was surrounded. By God's grace, it rained a lot, and that rain just soaked and sickened the army of the greatest leader that the Ottoman Empire ever knew, called Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the Caliph, the head of the empire.
And the city was under siege? Is that
Totally under siege. And quite miraculously, thanks to the German Landsknecht, which was a great fighting force, a German force with their long pikes, they were able to withstand the Ottoman Empire forces, who retreated. Okay, so you've got a battle constantly going on of the Ottoman Empire pressing upon Europe, which is divided between these two Christian leaders, and also Christianity is divided with the Reformation. On all fronts, everything is falling apart. So if you've got a strong group,
right,
and especially with a consistent idea and great ability to have military might, Europe had a century of being under deep threat by the Muslim forces of the Ottoman Empire. This came to a head in 1566. The story is fascinating, but we'll just get to we'll sort of shut it down. In 1565, there was a group called the Knights of Malta. Maybe you've heard of the Knights of Malta. They are still have their own country. They're a little teeny-weeny country. It's very interesting. Sidebar. If you go to Rome and you come to the place where the Sovereign Order of Malta has its country, there's a possibility that you can stand in one country, look through another, and see another. You stand in Italy, you look through the keyhole, you're looking through the Knights of Malta, and you see the Vatican. 1, 2, 3 countries, very few. Anyway, that's beside the point. They were created as hospitalers to support the Christian pilgrims on their way to their pilgrimage. And they were a constant thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire. They had great forces, great fleets, and they were able to be a real pain. Suleiman said, "I want them gone." In 1565, he sent a huge naval invasion filled with these janissaries to attack Malta, which was only defended by, I think, 500 knights and 3,000 of the Maltese, who really didn't like the knights that much because they were like a foreign imposition. But they didn't like even more the threat of Islamic conquest. Now, this was a vitally important moment because Malta was the key to open up the whole of the Mediterranean to Ottoman forces. At this time, Turkish forces were attacking all of Italy. There was still lots of massacres and enslavement. The level of Christian enslavement, and this is going to come into our story, was very high. They would raid, they would enslave Christians, make them galley slaves, bring them back. White Christian slaves were highly marketable.
Someone might not know what a galley slave is.
A galley slave, thank you. A galley, at this time, the kind of ships that they had were ships that had sails, but for war, they had rows of oarsmen that allowed them to turn. And the ships were basically transportation of land forces. That's the way it was all the time in the Mediterranean from Roman times. That the way in which naval battles, I know it might sound a little weird that a priest knows all this stuff. I like history. That the way that they would have naval battles.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a second, but a question for you. If you've been blessed by this video, you could help us out in a couple of very simple ways. Firstly, like and share this video. YouTube is going to see that and then suggest this message out to a larger audience. So that's something simple you could do. Secondly, could you pray for us? We're always in need of grace, and we'd greatly appreciate your prayers. And thirdly, if it is possible, consider supporting our mission at kenandjanelle.com. Your support allows us to continue producing videos just like the one you're watching. So thank you so much for the consideration. Now back to the conversation.
Naval battles. I know it might sound a little weird that a priest knows all this stuff. I like history. The way that they would have naval battles is that the ships would come together and they basically turn the sea into a land, and they would just fight back and forth that way. Pretty brutal. In any case, the Ottomans were attacking Malta, and that's a movie that has yet to be made, because it is just an amazing story of how they defeated Malta. This was to the great relief of Europe, such that Queen Elizabeth, that horrible person who was in England, she even sent a letter of thanks to the Knights of Malta for protecting and stopping this key part of the whole defense of Europe from falling to Muslim forces. Okay. A few years pass, and we're now at the year 1571. And in this time, we have the growth of a new, Suleiman had died, but his son is now on the throne, and he wants to continue this pressure.
Of the Ottoman Empire.
Of the Ottoman Empire, this pressure of fundamentally Muslim forces against the Christian forces. Yes. And here is the setup. Pope Pius V, Saint Pius V, saw this pressure. Venice had many lands, it was a naval power at the time, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they saw this growing threat. And so the Pope called a crusade, the formation of a Holy League, to oppose the coming of these forces, to do something to get together. Now, of course, we talk about Europe being all divided, squabbles broke out. Who was going to lead it? Where could they get power from? Well, by 1573, they were able to cobble together a pretty powerful force, but not as equal in number to the forces of the Muslim invaders. And they, under the leadership of the son of the emperor, Don Juan of Austria, they put together what is called the Holy League force. Pope Pius V asked that prayers to our Blessed Mother, especially the Rosary, be said as this battle was becoming imminent. And the critical moment happened on October the 7th, when at a place called Lepanto, which is just off the southern coast in the Adriatic Sea between Croatia and Greece, the Christian fleet engaged the Muslim Ottoman forces. And again, miracle of miracles, it was a thorough defeat of the Muslim forces. The Christians sustained great losses in that battle. I mean, the maneuvers and everything that went on, but not as many as the Muslims. So about 30,000 Ottomans died, and 15,000 of the 10,000 Christians died, 15,000 wounded in this battle, amongst whom was Cervantes, the great novelist of Don Quixote, who bore the rest of his life the scars of that Battle of Lepanto. But it was an incredible moment in the battle when they were able to get into the galleys of the Muslims and free the Christian slaves that were on the oars. And they gave them arms, and those slaves armed were able to join in the battle and in many ways turn the tide. It was an interesting, if you're a military historian, it's much more complicated than that.
So the question is that the Protestant Reformation has already kind of started prior to this. So was there any Protestants?
No.
So they're completely separated from Rome. They're not, but yet they greatly benefit.
Of course.
Yeah.
No, there was no Protestant. Okay. And in fact, Northern Europe wasn't very much involved because unfortunately the new Holy Roman Emperor was one of the two emperors that were a little bit sort of iffy on their Catholicism, right? The Habsburgs have always been the bulwark of Catholicism. And under them, under their leadership, they allowed the Jesuits and other preachers to come in and turn the tide in the Counter-Reformation. Okay, but so there's a mix of politics, but it's only the Catholic Christians who Spaniards and Italians. All right, and of the Italians, a lot of Venetians. In fact, one of the great Barbarigo, one of the great Venetian admirals, perished, as did all the leadership of Suleiman Pasha, who was the head of the Muslim forces, the Ottoman forces. Okay.
So in terms of the numbers, what are we talking about? Like, was it an equal match?
It was closer to an equal match than the other ones. It would have been about 3-2 Muslim Ottoman forces to Catholic forces. This was the last big battle of the galleys, where they were rowing and bashing into each other.
In history.
In history. Right. And it was the first time that Christians could see that what had been up to then an unstoppable military force, namely the Ottoman Empire, was able to be defeated. Now, the Christians didn't press their advantage after this defeat, because they started fighting with each other, like the Italians fighting with them, and the energy got dissipated, much to Pope Pius V's sadness. However, because at the time of this battle, there were special prayers going on to Our Lady, praying the Rosary, he declared that day as being Our Lady of Victories, and moving it from the earlier time of that earlier miraculous battle against the Cathars and the heretics to this fight with the existential threat of Islam and the Ottoman Empire. He moved it to October the 7th, the day of the battle, and he added to the Rosary the prayers that were, if you will, are extra scriptural. What do I mean? The prayers of the Hail Mary up until that point had been Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. That was the Hail Mary. He added, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. It was in celebration of this that this Pope, Pius V, turned to the Rosary. Why, in particular? He was a Dominican. So, a good son of St. Dominic, he established which until the time of St. John Paul II, the decades of the Rosary that were to be said, and added, in celebration of this victory, a prayer that was not so much, though the occasion was the action, and they thought it was the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I believe it as well, in this struggle. But that the greater struggle is the interior struggle of the human person. That's where the deepest battle is fought for every person in our souls. And in that struggle, we are given by God's grace the gift of Mary, who points to Jesus, and who with that motherly love unites us with her son, so that we in that battle can see the victory is already won.
What if in Lepanto the Ottoman Empire would have won? Carry that forward. What would have happened to Spain and Portugal and the trade routes and everything and Europe and bring that even forward to what would have happened here now, what they would call the New World, and set what do you think would have happened?
Well, that's alternative history sort of thinking, and it's a good question. I know what wouldn't have happened. There wouldn't have been a space given to Europe to develop what it had at its hands, namely the technological, civilizational, university education development based on Christianity that was allowed to flourish at the time. That part of the world was so divided that pressure would have probably seen, once again, what happened, the need for another Charles Martel. You know who Charles Martel was?
I don't.
Oh, okay. So Islam by the end of the first 100 years of time after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, if he actually lived, had conquered all of Spain and was moving into France. And it was at the Battle of my brain just went blank, that Charles Martel, it's one of the most famous battles, I should know it, stopped the Muslim forces from going in. And that would have been, France would have been all under the power of the Arab forces. And it took another, almost 700, it's almost 700 years for them to push the Islamic civilization out of Spain. So that's what would have happened again. Because the forces of Islam, they were raiding and they were attacking all over the place. They would have had freedom, if the battle had not been won, to continue their piracy. They had just a few years before gone all the way to Rome and threatened Rome. They were they destroyed many cities in southern Italy. We have many places that celebrate martyrdoms of Christians. In Bari, there's a special devotion to the 800 Christians who were butchered in the 15th century by Muslim raiders and by the Muslim forces. There was a great fight we don't understand it. You know who understands it are the Hungarians. They have been always on the forefront of the battle with that pressure from the Turkic Muslim forces. And that whole area of the Balkans has always been a place of battle. And that's why you find right now Hungary extremely resistant to allowing any Muslim refugees to come to their place. They said, we know what happens when they come.
Regarding that battle, did the Pope specifically ask prayers in asking the intercession of the Blessed Virgin?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so that was
part of it. Processions were asked across Europe so that everybody participated through prayer in this battle.
Particularly to the Blessed Virgin Mary?
Particularly to the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, that was the focus of all of the prayers across Europe.
Wow.
So it stayed that way as Our Lady of Victories until it was in 1623, Pope Gregory XIII. Might be wrong. There's all these different popes and I get old. But it was the name Our Lady of Victories was kind of replaced in the church by Our Lady of the Rosary, and that was made actually a feast to be celebrated on a Sunday. Okay? So that's the kind of history of that day. And there are many churches that are named Our Lady of Victory. And there are many churches that are named Our Lady of the Rosary, and that's a great devotion. And it is rooted in the confidence that Christians have known in their history that Our Lady is no wimp. Read the Magnificat. Sweet pictures of the Blessed Virgin Mary perhaps do not quite get the voice of Our Lady. You have cast down the mighty from their thrones and have lifted up the lowly. You have filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. I love listening to Jesus because I know when I hear of course I love listening to Jesus. Jesus is the Word of God. And yet his human voice also echoes with the voice of Mary and Joseph. We have to remember that. Like, Jesus was fully human, and I don't know about you, but as I get older, I realize I got a lot of my mom in me, and I got a lot of my dad in me, and it comes out. So too in Jesus. Of course, it's his Father in heaven that is most powerfully through that, but the way of his preaching, the tone of his voice, all those that were around him would have heard the tone of Mary's voice, and her strength, and Joseph's voice, and his strength, and his passion, and what he was interested in Jesus. And that continues. And Our Lady then really helps us in our confrontations, not only in battle. I see that there's some places called battle rosaries that you can get, reproductions of what soldiers had during the war.
Yeah.
Always turning to Our Lady. Always turning to Our Lady as a comfort. That is what Our Lady of Victory is about.
Thank you.
You're welcome.